as the United States was engaged in the war in Korea, and even slightly before, there's a much larger context going on. Korea occupied, yes, the news cycle, and it occupied the minds of those who were being called back to service that had been discharged from World War II, but the nation as a whole moved on. They're concerned about returning to their normal lives. They're concerned about the politics of the moment. They're not concerned as much about world affairs. Yes, containment's fine, and as historians looking back, we see the macro history, but the micro history is the people living out their day-to-day lives, going to the market and buying stuff and trying to make their lives as simple as possible and raise their families, and all of that has to be fit in the much larger context. And perhaps the greatest feature of the late 1940s and 1950s was the emergence of what we call the affluent society. A society based upon the wealth and consumerism that really strongly reflects the 1920s. It reflects the prevalence of stuff and America's desire to have it. We don't mind short-term sacrifices. We don't mind giving up of things for a while. But eventually we want to return to normalcy. And normalcy for America has become our gadgets, our gizmos, our things that we can buy. And so the 1950s reflects a growing prosperity. Now, looking on down the way, we see that this growing prosperity isn't universal, that it's not across-the-board prosperity, nor could it ever be, by the way. Even in communism, where they claim all are equal, there never was economic equality. That's simply not attainable, ever. But in the United States, there are those that, on the other side of the tracks, especially in Black America, that were not a part of the affluent society as much. And certainly there are areas of the nation that didn't do as well as others. And there's a growing element of the population that is disenchanted with the acquisition of stuff. They're tired of the consumer culture, and this produces a backlash, if you will. A backlash of those who say, you know, wait a minute, have we lost our way? And so this produces the counterculture of the 1960s, the hippie movement and the counter and the new left and the counterculture of the 1960s didn't just suddenly spontaneously occur. It grows out of the dissidence of the 1950s. But let's first, before we get to the detractors, let's look at the prosperity. Let's look at the wealth. Let's look at the politics, if you will, that sets the stage for the affluent society. We talked about in the last video on the Korean War that 1952 was an election year. And with it being an election year, both parties are looking for that candidate, the one that will be their shining knight to take them to the promised land of the White House and ultimately control of the government. Why anybody would want that job, I have not a clue. But nonetheless, the desire to control the White House drives both parties. And there's one man that it was clear from the beginning, whichever party could woo him to their side would have an inroad into capturing the White House. Now, Harry Truman is the first president limited by constitutional amendment to 2 terms. Well, actually, he's not limited by 2 terms. He's eligible if he so desires to run for another term because the amendment was passed while he was president. But with the passage of the 26th Amendment, the presidency is limited to 2.5 terms. Half if you're a vice president serves out a president's term, half of that term and 2 elected terms on your own. The problem for Harry Truman is whether to run for another term or not. Now, he had taken over at the start of Franklin Roosevelt's term. So he's, for the most part, had 2 full terms, and it's whether he wants to run or not. He desires General Dwight Eisenhower to declare himself a Democrat and become the Democratic candidate for 1952. In fact, Harry Truman told Eisenhower in a meeting that if Eisenhower would run for president, that Truman would certainly endorse him. And Eisenhower's reply is, well, I'm not a politician. I don't know anything about politics. Why would I want to be president? And Truman said, well, you leave the details to me. You just run as president. I'll be your vice president. But you run for election, and I'll stand by you. Well, Eisenhower gave it serious thought, and he ultimately went back to President Truman, and there was a marvelous book written a few years ago called The Truman-Eisenhower Split. Eisenhower told Truman, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I just simply cannot run as a Democrat. In my heart, I'm not a Democrat. I'm Republican. I'm from the heartland. I'm going to run for president, but I'm going to run as a Republican if the Republican Party gives me the nomination. Harry Truman never forgave Eisenhower for, in his view, betraying him and running as a Republican. Harry Truman, as much as I like Harry Truman, and I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, but Harry Truman, while he was a great president and he was certainly an astounding leader, he was passionate in his friends and he was also passionate in his enemies. And Eisenhower crossed the line in Truman's book. And so Truman's going to do everything that he can to make sure Eisenhower's not elected in 1952. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party didn't agree with him. The Democratic Party decides to answer Eisenhower's popularity with the intellectualism of the governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson was a popular governor, but he was an intellectual. And they sought to portray Eisenhower as somehow bumbling or dumb or incompetent versus Adlai Stevens' pointy-headed intellectual ability. This didn't play with the American people. The American people have been watching Dwight Eisenhower for well over a decade. You don't rise to the rank of five-star general. You don't rise to the level of a supreme commander of NATO forces by being an idiot. And Dwight Eisenhower was a likable guy. He was everybody's grandfather. He was jovial. He was friendly. He was relaxed. He was laid back, and yet there was no doubt that he was in charge. There was no doubt that he was committed to his ideological beliefs. So in the 1952 election, you have the Democrat Adlai Stevenson and the Republican Dwight Eisenhower, or as I lovingly refer to the election of 1952 as the Battle of Chrome Dome 1, the two bald-headed candidates running for office. And as I start to develop a little more beach here, I may be joining them soon. But the candidates for 1952, you know my theory that I've told you many times as we've talked about the politics of the day, you've got to have a catchy slogan. And the Republicans have a slogan that cannot be beaten. I like Ike. I'm for Ike. Ike and Dick. Let's clean house. And the poster in the middle indicates, the Democrats have been in charge of the government since 1932. This is 1952. They've had 20 years of control of the White House. And things have gotten out of hand. We've had Klaus Fuchs, and we've had Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, and we've had Greenglass, and we've had all of the problems of Alger Hiss, all those things that we've talked about that are coming to a head. We've had the largest nation on earth, China, go communist. We're fighting a war in Korea. Maybe it's time to clean house. What's needed is a change in leadership. And that resonated with the American people. And We like Ike, and even the buttons. Eisenhower would be the first to put together a coalition of Democrats that cross the line and vote with Republicans. Ronald Reagan will tap into this in the 80s, called Reagan Democrats. Well, there were Eisenhower Democrats, or as the button says, Dem-Ike-crats. My daughter, as I was working on this PowerPoint, she came in and wanted me to explain that to her. So an hour later, after explaining it to her, she looked at me and was like, "Thank you, Daddy. I don't think I understand." So Richard Nixon, as a communist hunter in California, the man who had prosecuted Alger Hiss, who had exposed communism in the State Department, and he's from that key state of California, bringing the West Coast with him. Eisenhower, he's been in the Army forever, so he really doesn't have a home state. So he chooses as his residency New York City. Now, between the 1952 election and the 1956 election, Eisenhower is going to change his venue. 52, he's a New Yorker. 56, he's a Pennsylvanian, settling around Gettysburg, buying a house and living there. He was born in Texas, so I guess Texas often claims him as their own. But you can see he was incredibly popular, especially in Republican states, but in Democratic states too. Texas has been solidly Democrat since the Civil War. But you can see the button with the map of Texas, Texans for Ike. And so this is going to be a tough election for the Democrats. Adlai Stevenson travels the nation, giving speeches that were less popular, but more probably intellectual in focus. But he certainly had the support, as you can see in the photograph in the upper left, Lauren Bacall and others from Hollywood supporting Adlai Stevenson, primarily because Hollywood reacting to the House Un-American Activities Committee investigation of Hollywood, and Hollywood being filled with communists, which, by the way, Hollywood was filled with communists, and there were many high-profile actors and producers that were communist. That still doesn't justify the witch hunt of the House Un-American Activities Committee in investigating the Hollywood 10. But Hollywood is reacting to Richard Nixon being chosen as the Republican vice presidential candidate, and it throws a lot of Hollywood leaders like Lauren Bacall behind Adlai Stevenson. And so the appeal to the people that if you elect Eisenhower is a former general, that he's going to get you into a war. Notice the button, draft Ike, and he will draft you. The height of irony is World War I was conducted under Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat. World War II had been Franklin Roosevelt. The Korean War is Harry Truman. And you elect a Republican as president, and while he has many opportunities to use the military, Eisenhower is one of the most restrained in using the military. In fact, he says, one of the most famous Eisenhower quotes is that, when you've been there and seen that, you don't want to send men in harm's way lightly. And so on Election Day, the nation responds, and the nation proves that they like Ike. In fact, looking at Texas, Eisenhower will be one of the first to break up the Solid South. And you're going to see an increasing transformation as more and more of those solid Democrat states become Republican. Eisenhower puts together a sterling cabinet, but no real shining spots in that except for Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. And we'll get into the foreign policy in the next video. But Eisenhower's domestic policy is focused on business growth. Eisenhower is going to endure a period of an economic downturn, and he does an amazing thing. As Eisenhower begins tinkering with the economy and buying into the idea of Keynesian economics, he decides to raise taxes. The economy starts slowing down. Then he turns around and lowers taxes. The economy takes off. Lesson learned. Eisenhower will preside over a fairly sound economy for most of his time in office. And he rarely gets the credit that is due him for the appointment of Ovida Culp Hobby as the first Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. That was a brand new department created in his cabinet. She was not only the first secretary, she was only the second woman in American history to hold cabinet rank. FDR had appointed the first woman, Frances Perkins, as Secretary of the Labor Department. But Ovida Culp Hobby, as the head of Health, Education, and Welfare, proves to be an excellent cabinet secretary and administrator of this department. She had been one of the highest-ranking women in World War II, being over the Women's Air Corps. She was married. You might recognize the name. She's from Texas, from Houston, married to the family of a governor. She and her family owned the Houston Chronicle newspaper, so she was highly influential. And one of the things that's not often, I've had a number of students over the years, I've encouraged them to write on this, and there's one small connection missing to make this just a huge topic. Eisenhower absolutely loved Ovida Culp Hobby's abilities. I don't want to turn that into some type of perverted thing. He loved her abilities. She was a very intelligent, guided, directed woman. And there is a lot of evidence out there that Dwight Eisenhower seriously looked at Ovida Culp Hobby for the presidency in 1960. The only thing that is missing is a direct link. He gave her his support, but he never came out and said, I want her to run in 1960 to be the first woman presidential candidate. There's just that one small piece missing. But everything else, she had Eisenhower's confidence, and he certainly supported her in all of her activities. Now, one of the questions that we're going to spend the rest of this video discussing is what made American society of the 1950s affluent? What made it so wealthy? What set it apart from the society of the 1940s and the 1930s? Well, certainly there's no depression. And there's no depression because of a number of reasons. Now, Keynesian economics, and I've used that term before, British economist John Maynard Keynes had argued as early as the 1920s that governments could manage the economy of a nation by regulating government spending, by regulating the flow of currency, and that in times of depression you can stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates. In times of inflation you can slow down the economy by increasing interest rates, and that the government can keep the economy in balance. And he argued that government spending is one of the ways that is accomplished. And so the first factor that made the 1950s the affluent society was rampant government spending in the economy. Government money used to build housing, especially for African American communities in the Northeast and the North. So government provided housing, but also government funding for schools around the nation. This is one of the first times that the U.S. government has gotten so closely involved with what was often seen before the New Deal as private enterprise, housing and schools. That's local things. But now the government is increasingly involved in the activities of the state, the community, the individual. And the government spends millions of dollars to stimulate growth in these areas. And so prior to we get the big impetus of the 1930s, but the economy was already in a depression, and so government spending wasn't enough to bring it out. It took World War II. But now, with the economy humming, government spending is the accelerator or the brake, depending on what needs to be done to slow down or to speed up the economy. And government spending's where that happens. A second area that makes the affluent society affluent, who puts the money in the 1950s, is the GI Bill, veterans benefits. Millions of servicemen returning home from World War II are eligible for the GI Bill. They're eligible for low-interest loans on houses. They're eligible for the government to pay their schooling. And so as these young boys that went off to war at 17, 18, 19, 20, who had gone straight out of high school to the beaches of Tarawa or the beaches of Guadalcanal or fought at Bastogne, these young boys returning now as young men, taking advantage of the GI Bill, entering college. This is the golden age of American colleges and universities. A lot of your junior colleges had to be created during this time to meet the demand for the millions of servicemen wanting to get an education that the government's paying for. And they earned, but the government's paying the bill, unlike in previous wars where maybe you get a pension, maybe you don't. This is not only benefiting the nation because the servicemen are content and not rioting in the streets. They're not waiting for a bonus. They're not returning to the workforce for jobs that don't yet exist. They're going straight into the economy by the government paying their tuition, buying their books. That then pays the salaries of instructors and faculty and staff and administrators. And it's the golden age of the colleges and universities, driven by the veterans' benefits. And while I focused on education, that other area, low-interest loans, is the third thing that drives the economy, the creation of housing, especially the suburbs. Now, think about this. If you're a serviceman, you've gone off and you've seen just absolute horrors. You've been a tail gunner in a B-17 over the air of Europe. You've seen crewmen in your plane horrifically killed by shrapnel, or you were one of those guys that frostbitten at Bastogne, or in the Pacific, you were in the mud and the coral and the horrors of taking the beaches of Guadalcanal. You've seen the horrors of war, and you return home. One of the first things that you want to do is to establish a family, to get some permanence, to put down roots. And the government makes that possible with low-interest loans for veterans especially, but those who had stayed at home and worked in the factories, women who had worked in the factories, all of that money is there and they're ready now to put down roots. And the idea of William Jared Levitt to create whole communities, and you can see in the upper left the idea of the Levittown, and there were Levittowns all over America. We call them suburbs today, but the original Levittowns. The idea you take 4 or 5 blueprints and facades, and you construct them, and you can see how the towns are laid out. This is common things for us today, but this is new in the 1940s and the 1950s. You take those 4 housing plans, and you build them, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then, so that the human eye, as they see the layout of the block, you don't want them to pick up on the pattern. You start alternating the 4 plans. So you 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you mirror it so that the door, which was on the left, is now on the right, and you change the facades around. This one's brick. This one's stucco. This one's panel. Whatever. You change up the outside exterior. Same floor plan. Same materials involved in the construction, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it would be 3, 4, 2, 1, and you go down, but there's no common pattern to the construction of the housing, so that they all look unique. They all look like they were handcrafted. They are all balloon construction, meaning you put up the frame, then clad the exterior to it, then it's open on the inside. But one of the things that you're going to see, and this is once again, if you grew up in Houston, Dallas, wherever, this isn't that new to you. I grew up in the country, so not having a front yard was new to me. But one of the changes in the creation of the Levitt towns and the suburbs is the emphasis of the house. The emphasis isn't the front yard. Ma and Pa aren't sitting out on the porch swing on the front yard welcoming all who walk down the street to come in and have a glass of lemonade. The emphasis now is on the backyard and the seclusion, the privacy. You put fences up between the houses so that neighbors rarely even know each other anymore. But as you move into these houses, the focus is on the backyard. And think about these houses. We put this as what stimulates the affluent society. Well, you've got the house itself, but this is emblematic of all the other things that go with this house. For those of you who are 18, 19, 20, you're going to start out. At some point, you're going to get married. You're going to start a family. What do you need? Well, even in your basic college apartment, you got to have a place to sit. You got to have some place to eat. So, a table, chairs, dishes, all that it has industry supporting it. So it's putting people to work. And so as the suburbs grow, so do all the industries that provide stuff for them. Even, today, the barbecue in the backyard. Well, that really gets cranked up here in the 1940s and 1950s. The big barbecue pit in the backyard, the swimming pool in the backyard, the kids' swing set in the backyard. All of that has to be produced and fuels the economy. And so the suburbs provide cheap housing, convenient housing that feeds the needs of this growing populace that wants to work in the city but live outside the city. And so the idea of the suburbs, it's not urban, it's suburban. It's outside the city. And so then to get from one place to another, to get to the office, to get to work, you're going to have an automobile. But before I go there, I want to talk about one more thing that's involved in the suburbs. Mom and Dad get together. She worked in the factory during World War II. He was in the Army. They return to, they get together. They do what married couples do. They're going to have children. Their focus is here. Mom has her kids, and we'll talk about the baby boom later. But notice how these houses are so tightly together, and in most of these houses, in an overwhelming number, today you look at the suburbs and you go through a community during the daytime, it's almost a ghost town. Dad's off working, mom's off working, kids are at school. It's almost you don't expect tumbleweeds to blow down the road. Not so in the 1940s and 1950s. The standard, whatever the standard American family is, the standard American family was the dad goes off to the office in town, mom stays in the suburb, mom's at home being bored out of her skull with the crumb crunchers crawling on the carpet. And so the idea of alleviating the isolation and loneliness of mom in the residence spawns a number of industries that you still have today. Tupperware. How was Tupperware sold? Well, you didn't just go house to house selling Tupperware and all of the plastic goods that come of vogue in the 1950s. You had Tupperware parties. When I was a kid, my mom was a Tupperware saleswoman, and she would host a Tupperware party and invite all of her friends to the house or go to somebody else's house, and they would provide hors d'oeuvres and drinks, and they would demonstrate all of these new gimmicky things that Tupperware had. I mean, I remember having one of these as a kid. It was called a Pop-A-Lot. It was like a big cone with a air compressor thing on the bottom, and you had a ball in it, and you'd hit it, and it'd shoot the ball up in the air, and then My sister had the other Pop-A-Lot, and she'd catch the ball, and then you launch it back. You know, it was a new thing. It was a gimmicky thing that Tupperware had. But not only Tupperware, but the idea of Mary Kay cosmetics, cosmetic parties, lingerie parties, the whole idea of women, and it wasn't that the product was being sold, and yeah, products would be bought, but women getting together to break the isolation of the suburbs. America hadn't yet become the two-car family. So while Dad's got the car at the office, Mom's stuck at home and needed some outlet. And so whole communities of women with a one woman babysitting or a couple of women babysitting, and then the other moms would get together and talk Tupperware, talk cosmetics, but anything to escape. But Dad's got to get into the office, and another factor that makes the American society of the 1950s, the affluent society, is the automobile. Americans love their automobile. The bigger, the better. The bigger the tail fins, the better. The flashier the chrome, the better. The worse gas mileage, the better. And this is the golden age of the massive Detroit autos. And you just see, I picked 1957 just, for a lark. And there were even more cars just for the sake of space that I didn't put on here. But all of the 1957 autos that came out in the variety of colors, and Americans loved their auto. And once again, like we talked about in the 20s, what can you do with that auto? That auto is an industry in and of itself, and it opens up, the gas stations, the repair facilities, the asphalt companies, the upholstery companies, all of that. And then in the 1950s, Americans got really creative, and they opened up theaters exclusively for automobiles. The drive-in theater. It's kind of ironic that this Christmas, the new Star Wars movie is going to be opening. And I was thinking back and reflecting on that. I saw the first Star Wars, the original one, the best one, in the 1970s at a drive-in theater in Longview, Texas, doing the typical East Texas drive-in theater thing. We were in my aunt's pickup, and you sat in lawn chairs in the back of the pickup and watched the movie. That's how I saw Star Wars for the first time, in the back of a pickup in a lawn chair. But the drive-in theater became the place to go. Oh yeah, and occasionally there was even a movie for you to watch, as you can see the two making out in the middle. It was a place to escape, to use the bordello on wheels again, to get away from Mom and Dad's watchful eyes. Or maybe even Mom and Dad getting away, whatever. But the idea of a theater that caters to you in your car. Once again, notice the isolation and the individualism. That we're not even in a theater with others. We're sitting in our enclosed environment. We can put the speaker in our windows, and I don't know that any of these show a speaker hanging on the window, but you put the speaker on the window and run the cord in, or you can put the speaker on your dash and roll the window back up so that just the cord comes through the window, and you can listen to the movie that you're seeing up on the big screen in the isolation of your vehicle. Maybe walking to the concession stand and getting your goodies to eat in the vehicle. And then, of course, if you wanted with your friends, you ride in the front and the friends in the back, and it became maybe a little bit broader social context. Long gone are the days, in the picture in the lower middle, long gone are the days of the 25-cent movie. Good luck with that. But not only are we taking our vehicles for entertainment, and of course there's always the entertainment of the drag race and stock car races and the racing of the vehicles, but the entertainment of the vehicles at the theater, we even broaden our view of mealtime. Rather than the traditional sit-down meal where everybody gets together at the table, increasingly food becomes fast food. So a picture of the original McDonald's the original Sonic, the original Burger King, the original A&W Root Beer. And I just chose those because they were familiar restaurants with us here in East Texas. And then in all of them, I chose not only their current logos, but also their original logos to put on there for you to see. You know, the McDonald's specialized in speedy hamburgers. And then Sonic, if you've ever wondered why Sonic was called Sonic, well, because as the founder of Sonic, who was in Oklahoma, saw this used at another restaurant, he applied it to the restaurant he owned, and it became the Sonic Drive-In. But it's service at the speed of sound. Service at the speed of sound, meaning you drive up to Sonic, you mash the button, you place your order, a car hop brings it to you. Now Sonic's even streamlined that. You can park your car and wait for service at the speed of sound, or you can just wait in line and go through the drive-in window. I'm not saying I go to Sonic, but I just happen to know how it works. But Sonic, service at the speed of sound, and back in the day to speed up service, you know, Sonic even today pays extra for car hops who can deliver food and skate at the same time. So anybody who could skate. I remember as a kid going to Sonic, and they would not only deliver it to you on roller skates, which I found fascinating as a kid, but they would put on your drink little plastic, almost glass, but plastic figures, elephants and giraffes, and then they would hang them on your drink, and they were really cool toys that you could play with. In fact, I came across some the other day in an old Monopoly set that my mother had gotten from my grandfather, that they collected those and added them as new playing pieces to their Monopoly board. But service at the speed of sound. And then, of course, A&W Root Beer, their thing was homemade root beer. We used to have an A&W here in town. I don't think we do anymore. I remember as a kid eating at A&W Root Beer in Longview. I don't even think that's there anymore. But certainly fast food becomes an American thing, rolling up in your car and ordering and never leaving your car, never having to socialize with others, but staying right there in your confined environment. And to facilitate the growth of the American automobile industry, Dwight Eisenhower will sign into law one of his chief objectives, the creation of an interstate highway system. Now, as I told you in an earlier video, but I want to remind you, Eisenhower didn't get the idea from seeing the German Autobahn. Eisenhower had the idea for an interstate highway system from the 1920s when he served as an officer in a cross-country expedition to drive a convoy from the Atlantic to the Pacific to demonstrate the need for a road system. Now, he certainly gets some more of the ideas for it, seeing the German Autobahn during World War II, but he will create the interstate highway system. And if you notice how the interstate highway system is constructed, there are no lights, there are no stop signs, there's nothing that besides traffic congestion and work and wrecks and things like that. But supposedly traffic is supposed to seamlessly flow from one point to another without stopping, and it facilitates cross-continent commerce. But even more than that, Eisenhower was painfully aware of the size of the United States and the need to militarily defend parts of the United States if it was ever invaded. And so the interstate highway system is set up to be defensive in nature, and within certain miles there has to be straight sections that can be used as landing strips. So in the event of the Soviets ever bombing the major airports, well, the interstate highway system could be used as airfields if necessary. And so the interstate highway system facilitates the quick transport of goods and services across long distances. In addition, not only does he sign into law the interstate highway system, which it's almost impossible to estimate how many billions of dollars of commerce the highway system opened up. But also the creation of the St. Lawrence Seaway System, a system of locks and dams on the St. Lawrence River in Canada into the Great Lakes that makes the Great Lake cities world ports, such as Chicago. It's a port city now as well as a rail hub because of the St. Lawrence Seaway, opening up the Great Lakes to commerce. Ohio becomes an international seaport. Once again, millions, if not billions of dollars of commerce are enabled because of the creation of the system of locks and dams that allow shipping to go from Ohio or Illinois to the world via the St. Lawrence River. What else put the money in the affluent society? Well, certainly technology growing out of World War II and the research and development of World War II, the first computers. The first digital computer, the Avodac, January 1953, and then exponentially growing from there as new computers and new technologies come out, which then trickle down into what we have today. I mean, our modern society is predicated on this beginning, from cell phones to the internet to the computer systems. Ironically, your handheld calculator, maybe even your cell phone, has more computing power than that whole big system you see in that room. But nonetheless, Americans fell in love with technology, and the research and development grants enabled a whole new frontiers of research. Research and development became an industry in and of itself. But Americans weren't all work. They also like to be entertained, and this is the growth of the entertainment industry directly in your house. Most of these shows that you see appearing on television had their roots in radio programs. I think only one of them went the other way. I can't remember which one, but one of those, it may have been Wagon Train or Gunsmoke that I think it was Gunsmoke. It started out as a TV program and went backwards to a radio program. But in general, all of these were radio programs that became television programs. And America became addicted to the TV. I was just saying this morning, I should have put a picture in here of, we went this summer to Disney World and all of the stuff that Disney has. Well, the way Disney advertised that stuff to kids, the way they still advertise stuff to kids, every morning my 3-year-old daughter wants to watch Disney Channel. Well, all that stuff that they show on Disney Channel, they've got rides, they've got souvenirs at their theme parks that your kids not only play with the toys that you buy them from Toys R Us or Target or Walmart or wherever. You not only have the toys that you constantly play with, then you can go to their theme parks and you can meet the characters and you can ride the rides. And so entertainment becomes a massive industry, and television becomes a massive industry that involves money, and advertising on those programs becomes major money. And so television puts the money in the affluent society. Add to that the baby boom. The baby boom. You can see the graph as Americans return from World War II. Prior to World War II, you can see the beginnings of the Great Depression. First time in American history during the years of the Great Depression, the American populace actually declined. More people either immigrated out of the United States or died than were born or came to the United States. Well, that began to reverse itself in the 1940s, and then certainly in the war years, and you can see the delineation beginning in 1945, 1946, the start of the baby boom, continuing on to the 1960s. And that is the peak of the baby boom, as these soldiers from World War II, from Korea, ultimately from Vietnam, returned home and began having children. And then guiding their parenting, probably the most influential, and I'm keeping my comments to myself on this book, but one of the most influential books of the 1950s was Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care. And what Benjamin Spock said is, prior to the 1950s, American child rearing focused on the family, focused on the unit. But that did harm to the child, and the child needed to be the focus of the family. And so the child's individual development, the child's individual needs, so rather than being one of the group, the child became an individual, and the parents needed to cater to the needs of the child, not the child learning to accommodate the needs of the family. A total reversal of the traditional American family. But add to that, not only do you have, babies being born, which becomes an industry in and of itself through the medical profession, you have this huge, and believe me, when you have children, if you don't have children already, you're going to see this huge consumer culture out there for taking care of children. Everything from diapers, and now in this day and time that was cloth diapers, but you still had to have the cloth diapers. You still had to have a place to store those diapers. You still had to take care of their food needs. You still had to have the toys, the stuff. When you have a child, you find out all this stuff you've lived with your whole life and didn't have to have. Your house becomes cluttered with all the flotsam and jetsam of childhood. We got stuff at our baby shower. I still don't even know what it does. And I've got an 8-year-old now. But I've got stuff we got when she was prior to her birth that we've never even used. But all of the stuff that focused on that baby and the development and nourishment of that baby. And so the baby boom fueled American society. The American society became affluent because of savings and credit. You have all of the money saved during the war years, but even beyond that, you had the growth of easy and flexible credit. And I've given you just some examples here, everything from gas credit cards to Diners Club, to American Express, to Visa, to MasterCard, even furniture stores that in the middle you have the little wallet with your quick revolving credit account card that you provide to get that immediate need for furniture. You don't have to go through the approval process. Just the Americans wanting their stuff and wanting it now. And Madison Avenue, through its advertising, making you want stuff that you don't need, and using either our savings or buying on credit and paying it out, Americans begin living beyond their means. And then, of course, once you see your debt accumulating, that puts pressure on you, which then becomes an industry in and of itself, high blood pressure and all of the medical stuff that goes with living beyond your means. And then finally, what made the affluent society of the 1940s and 1950s? Well, certainly the Cold War and the military spending necessary to keep up with the Soviets. In modern term, keeping up with the Joneses, keeping up with your next door neighbor. Well, not only are we doing that now in the suburbs, we're trying to keep up with the Joneses by having the newest and greatest barbecue pit, or the newest and greatest swimming pool, or the newest and greatest gadgets. But now we're going to have that nationwide. We've got to be better than the other guys because the world is a dangerous place. And the world is a dangerous place. But every politician that wants to be elected sells to the American people that if you elect me, then we're going to fill this area in which we're behind, and we're going to discover that there are missile gaps, and there are bomber gaps, and that there are tank gaps, and there are ship gaps, and that we need a newer and greater aircraft carrier because the Soviets are thinking about possibly developing one. And so military spending goes through the roof, far more than we spent even to win World War II is now spent in research and development building the bigger and badder weapons. And throughout the 50s and the 60s, because of the threat of a Soviet atomic attack, bombers like the B-36 Peacemaker, or later the B-52, will be merged into a unit called the Strategic Air Command, in which a percentage of the bombers are kept flying around the clock in preparation for that surprise attack. And so military spending, well, people have to make those weapons. So the industry is not only making the consumer goods that people are buying, but we're making the goods that the government is then buying, whether it be aircraft or ships or tanks or missiles. And all of that requires technology, which then requires the education that the veterans are going and getting with the GI Bill. And it becomes almost circular, building upon itself, as the United States becomes the economic dynamo of the world, spending and outbuying any nation on earth, being the wealthiest nation on earth. But that also means to preserve that lifestyle, we had to depart from George Washington's injunction to avoid entangling alliances. Well, now we're involved with NATO. Dwight Eisenhower is going to keep us out of war, but he's going to keep us out of war by continuing to violate what George Washington told us. He's going to get us involved in all kinds of treaties and pacts and associations around the globe. And all of that is predicated on the American taxpayer being willing to fund the bill, to defend the American way. And we're going to look at those challenges to the American foreign policy and American economics next time in the second video on the Eisenhower administration.